Weekends are busy on Fields Avenue in Balibago. Young women greet meandering men and invite them into the bars that line the street. Known as the supermarket of sex, Angeles City's red light district has fast become a top destination for sex tourism. However, in the Philippines, prostitution is illegal. Yet here, an entire economy has grown around it. Male travelers from Asia, Australia, the US, Europe, and even from the Middle East constitute the bulk of the arrivals at Clark Airport, a former US military airbase. From there, many flock to the bars and clubs of Fields Avenue, and to the impoverished young women who work there. Acquiring their company for the night is straightforward. For a small fee, the men obtain what is known as an early work release that permits them to take the woman of their choice back to their hotel. It is a trade that thrives in the Philippines, where there are an estimated 500,000 sex workers, almost a fifth of whom are minors. So how did this happen? How did a predominantly Catholic country spend an estimated $400 million on prostitution there each year? You see, a large number of children have been conceived in such exchanges, and many more children never even meet their biological father and are left to live in poverty. This is not just the story of prostitution. It is the story of how war, empire, poverty and technology reshaped an entire society, leaving consequences that are still being counted today. A country of roughly 117 to 120 million people, making it one of the 14 most populous nations on Earth, all of it fits into a land area of roughly 300,000 square kilometers, smaller than the US state of Arizona. Today, the Philippines is known as a budget-friendly travel destination. But long before tourists arrived in search of cheap flights, beaches and nightlife, the Philippines was something else entirely, a staging ground. Since 1947, the United States had operated two of its largest overseas military installations on Philippine soil, Clark Air Base in Angeles City and Subic Bay Naval Base in Olongapo. For years, they were relatively quiet outposts. Then, everything changed. In 1965, American combat troops began pouring into Vietnam, and because the Philippines was geographically close and politically allied with the United States, its military bases became something more than strategic installations. They became places where exhausted soldiers came to rest. The US military called it R&R, rest and recreation. Thousands of servicemen rotated through Clark and Subic between deployments, carrying combat pay, free time, and for many, a desire to spend that money quickly. And where thousands of young men arrived with money and time, a local economy quickly formed around them. Fields Avenue in Angeles City and the streets surrounding Subic's main gate in Olongapo began filling with bars, nightclubs, restaurants, and so-called hospitality businesses designed to serve the incoming troops. What had once been provincial towns were transformed into garrison economies, increasingly dependent on foreign military spending. But the money did not stay inside the bars. It created an entire network of workers, recruiters, landlords, hotel owners, drivers, and businesses whose livelihoods became connected to the military presence. Some women working in the bars entered informal relationships with servicemen. These arrangements ranged from brief paid encounters to longer-term companionship, sometimes resembling the key women relationships seen around American troops in wartime Saigon. Others arrived from poorer provinces after being promised jobs in restaurants, hotels, or domestic service, only to discover that the work they had been recruited for was something very different. And this distinction matters, because the sex industry around the bases wasn't created by tourism alone. It was created by an ecosystem of foreign military money, local poverty, labor migration, and demand. By the time American involvement in Vietnam ended in 1975, the machinery around Clark and Subic had been running for a decade. And unlike Saigon, where the industry lost its customer base overnight when the war ended, the bases themselves stayed through the fall of Saigon, through the Marcos dictatorship, through the 1980s. The Philippines didn't inherit the Vietnam War's sex economy by accident. It inherited the infrastructure that made it possible. The bars, the recruitment networks, the normalized presence of foreign men paying for company. Vietnam gave the war. The Philippines gave the base towns that outlasted it. When the US finally withdrew from Clark in 1991 and Subic in 1992, after a volcanic eruption and the end of the basing agreement, many assumed the industry built around them would collapse with the troops gone. But it didn't. So the question became, if the soldiers were gone, what would keep the industry alive? To answer that, we have to look beyond the bars and into the economy that surrounded them. Through the 1970s and 1980s, President Ferdinand Marcos pursued an ambitious strategy: turn the Philippines into a global tourism destination. Manila's Ermita district was redeveloped with hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues. International visitors were actively courted, and tourism was promoted as a source of much-needed foreign currency. But the Philippines was facing a much deeper problem. The country was accumulating debt. Corruption was widespread. Martial law had reshaped political and economic life. And for local communities struggling to survive, tourism money was money that was difficult to ignore, regardless of where some of it was being spent. Then the economic shocks began to pile up. The debt crisis of the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, and, beneath both of them, a problem that never completely disappeared: chronic underemployment. For millions of Filipino families, these were not simply numbers in government reports. They meant empty rice fields, factories that weren't hiring, cities where thousands of people competed for a handful of jobs, and wages that often failed to keep pace with the cost of living. For many families, there was another escape route: migration. Millions of Filipinos began leaving the country to work overseas, sending money home to support parents, children, and relatives. The Philippines would eventually become one of the world's major labor-exporting countries. But not everyone could leave. And for those trapped in poorer provinces, the choices could become painfully narrow. Researchers studying the sex industry repeatedly point to the same underlying vulnerabilities: rural poverty, family debt, limited education, and a labor market unable to absorb the country's growing workforce. And this is where the industry's recruitment system became so important. A woman might be approached with an offer to work in a restaurant. Another might be promised a job as a waitress. Someone else might be told there was domestic work waiting in Manila. Sometimes those jobs were genuine, sometimes they weren't. Recruiters could be strangers, they could be acquaintances, and sometimes they could even be people from the same community. The journey often followed a remarkably predictable path. The province, then the city, then the bar. And once inside the system, finding a way back out could be far more difficult than getting in. This is what makes the economic story so important. But there is an important distinction. Poverty did not create the demand. The demand came from somewhere else. What poverty did was make participation in that market possible. And once the industry had customers, infrastructure, recruiters, and a steady supply of people looking for work, it no longer needed the American military to survive. It had become an economic system of its own. And that system was about to encounter something even more powerful than tourism. By the 1990s and 2000s, the industry had a new name for itself: tourism. Areas like Angeles City's Fields Avenue, Puerto Galera, and parts of Boracay rebuilt themselves around entertainment and hospitality licensing. Categories broad enough to cover everything from ordinary bars to establishments built entirely around commercial sex. On paper, these were legitimate businesses paying taxes and employing staff. However, in practice, researchers and law enforcement have repeatedly found trafficking victims working inside them. This is the blurred line at the center of the modern industry. Some women work in these establishments by choice as an income source like any other service job. Others are recruited under false pretenses, have their documents held, or are financially trapped by manufactured debts to bar owners, a pattern investigators call debt bondage. Philippine and international law draws a hard legal line between the two, between commercial sex work and human trafficking. But from the outside, on the same street, in the same club, that line can be almost invisible. It's why raids on Fields Avenue establishments so often produce the same headline. A bar advertised as ordinary nightlife turns out to be holding trafficking victims, sometimes minors, behind a business license that looked, on paper, entirely legal. The Philippines has strengthened its legal response over the years. The 2003 Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act, expanded in 2012 and again in 2022, carries penalties of up to 20 years imprisonment. Task forces combining the National Bureau of Investigation, the Philippine National Police, and international partners like US Homeland Security investigations have carried out repeated raids into 2025, rescuing dozens of victims from establishments in Angeles City alone. But officials themselves acknowledge the gap between law and enforcement. Slow courts, under-resourced digital forensics units, too few prosecutors, and, for years, a reluctance to question the foreign nationals found on the premises during these raids, the customers, not just the traffickers. Put together, what does this industry actually look like today? Estimates vary enormously depending on who is counting and how. Advocacy organizations have placed the number of Filipinos in some form of commercial sexual exploitation as high as 800,000, with over 100,000 of them minors. Government figures are far more conservative, reflecting only cases formally investigated. The truth almost certainly sits in the vast, undocumented space between the two. Geographically, the industry is no longer confined to old base towns. Angeles City and Olongapo remain the most internationally notorious hubs. But researchers also point to Ermita in Manila, Cebu City, Puerto Galera, and Boracay as long-standing centers of both licensed nightlife and unlicensed exploitation. What's changed most is character, not just location. What began as a wartime bar economy became a tourism-branded nightlife industry and has now split into two parallel tracks. A physical, in-person trade, still concentrated in a handful of well-known districts, and a digital, borderless trade that requires no physical destination at all. The Philippine government has held the highest ranking, Tier 1, in the US State Department's annual trafficking report in recent years, reflecting genuine legal and institutional effort. But that ranking measures government response, not the size of the underlying problem, which independent researchers still describe as vast, adaptive, and only partly visible to the systems built to fight it. Journalists covering the Strip have repeatedly connected two figures that rarely appear in the same sentence. An estimated 500,000 people working in the sex trade nationally, with roughly a fifth reported to be minors, alongside an estimated $400 million a year moving through an industry that remains, on paper, entirely illegal. Not every number attached to this industry holds up to scrutiny. In 2011, the sitting US ambassador to the Philippines told a judicial forum that as much as 40% of foreign male visitors came to the country for sex tourism, a claim that made international headlines. Within weeks, under pressure from Philippine officials who said no government data supported the figure, he retracted it and apologized for citing a statistic he couldn't back up. It's a useful caution. Even officials working to fight this trade sometimes reach for numbers bigger than the evidence. What's harder to dispute is what happens after the tourists go home. Men from overseas, Australia, the United States, Europe, are estimated to have fathered tens of thousands of children with Filipino sex workers over the decades, most never acknowledged, many growing up in the same poverty their mothers were trying to escape. In recent years, an Australian-led project has begun using consumer DNA databases to reverse that anonymity, helping now grown children identify the foreign fathers who never knew or never wanted to know they existed, and in some cases securing child support decades later. It's a strange kind of epilogue, an industry built on men disappearing, now being quietly unwound by the children they left behind. If there is a single thread running through this entire history, it is this. Every time one form of the industry was suppressed, another form took its place. The war ended, but the base towns stayed. The bases closed, but the tourism branding took over. Raids shut down individual bars, but recruitment networks simply moved to the next province, the next city, the next license. And when law enforcement finally began catching up to the physical bar trade, the industry had already found a new frontier, one with no border checkpoint at all. What tourism promotion started in the Marcos era as an economic strategy, poverty sustained through the decades that followed, weak enforcement allowed to persist, and the internet has now made borderless. Talk to enough people who study this industry, and a phrase comes up again and again. The fantasy sells itself. Online forums and word-of-mouth networks trade in a familiar image, a tropical paradise, welcoming and uncomplicated, where availability is assumed rather than negotiated. It's a story foreign visitors tell themselves long before they land, one that erases the debt, the recruitment, and the poverty underneath it, before a single bar fee changes hands. Recent market research surveys have gone as far as ranking the Philippines third worldwide as a sex tourism destination for American travelers, a claim worth treating carefully since it comes from a single consumer survey rather than a peer-reviewed study. But even critics of that ranking don't dispute the underlying point it's making, that a country wrestling with a well-documented child trafficking crisis is at the same time being casually marketed as a bucket list destination for exactly that trade. Understanding this history is not about sensationalizing what happens on Fields Avenue or reducing an entire country to a single grim statistic. It is about recognizing how a war fought somewhere else, an economic strategy adopted decades ago, and a global demand that never had to show up in person, combined to build something that has now outlasted every attempt to dismantle it. Because in the Philippines, as in Vietnam before it, the war didn't end when the last base closed. Its economy simply learned to survive without it.